This episode of Beer and Bullshit is brought to you by Woodhouse Brewing Company in Toronto. Woodhouse brews the refreshing beers using only choice ingredients and no preservatives. Check out their brewpub in Toronto today and enjoy their newly opened patio. Welcome to another episode of Beer and Bullshit. We've got a fantastic episode for you this week, one that I'm very excited about. My guest on the show this week is one Michael Hancock. Now, if you're a craft beer person, I probably don't need to explain anymore. If you aren't, let me explain that Michael Hancock is one of the craft beer pioneers in Ontario, Canada. But before we get into that, yes, I'm having a beer. I'm proud to say we made it 7 episodes before you heard that sound that is apparently mandatory on all beer podcasts. But that was me opening a beer because it's been a Tuesday, ladies and gents. That was Burst, a New England Pale Ale from Great Lakes Brewery. Great Lakes Brewery, of course, is an official beverage sponsor of the program. They sent me this beer along with some of their RTDs that's ready to drink for the uninitiated. I've got their new gin soda and vodka soda, which I had one this evening. I had a gin soda with lime. I added a couple slices of cucumber because I'm weird like that. So I recommend checking one out. Have not had the Burst yet, but it smells delightful, and it's Great Lakes Brewery, and it is a hoppy beverage. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to be satisfied with what I'm drinking. And speaking of satisfied, I'm pretty confident that the uh, uninitiated and the beer nerd will be quite satisfied with this week's episode. Truth be told, Michael Hancock, I knew I wanted him to be a guest on this podcast before I even had a podcast. He and I have been going back and forth actually for months trying to get him onto the show. Michael has been brewing beer since the late 80s and most recently was the brewmaster and then brewmaster emeritus at Side Launch in Collingwood. And he was a little hesitant to come on the show because, as he put it, I had a reputation as a bit of a loose cannon, which is funny because he refers to himself as a loose cannon in our interview. But there were circumstances surrounding Michael's departure from his last job that needed to be handled delicately, so he wanted to make sure that would be done. He listened to the first 5 episodes of the show and decided he wanted to come on. We had a few ground rules, places we couldn't go, and we didn't go there. So I'll leave the listener to draw their own conclusions around that subject matter when you listen to the interview. But I'm glad Michael finally came on the show. I'm hard pressed to think of anyone in Ontario beer with as deep a knowledge and passion for craft beer as Michael. Honestly, I feel a little bit like we barely scratched the surface. There's so much we could have talked about. And truth be told, there was a lot going on at my house when we recorded with my kid and my dog and bedtime, so I was hovered over the mute button a bit and maybe a little distracted, but we had a good chat. Michael took some time to look back at his long and illustrious career in beer. Hopefully, it's a career that's not over, but whatever happens next, for sure, he's made a deep and lasting impact in the craft beer scene, and yeah, he's a cool dude. Here's Michael Hancock. You're like the original gangster of Ontario craft beer. I mean, there's only a handful of names that have been doing craft beer in Ontario as long as you have.
I mean, Ron, you got Ron Keefe, myself. You've obviously got a Amsterdam crew,
Yep,
and Brick.
yep,
And I don't know if Muskoka was around then, but Creemore had just started. I think one
and
of the things I'm really lucky to have done is be one of the first. It makes it quite easy, whether it's one of the first on a small scale in a brew pub, or one of the first, for instance, to do a wheat beer,
hmm
which I was, and I think that helped put it on the map. Anyway.
yeah. Well, I mean, the wheat beer wasn't just because you were the first. I mean, the wheat beer was largely regarded and still is as one of the best in the world, right? That was kind of the kind of what put you on the map in terms of people hearing about you was the Weiss beer was ranked by, I guess it was Rate Beer as
It was
one of the
right there.
best in the world, right?
Mhm.
So it's not just because you were first. It was pretty good beer. Still is.
Well, and it still is. I really mean that because obviously my concern is when you haven't been around for a year or so, to keep trying what I would still regard to be the flagship product, and I think it is probably the biggest seller, I just had one yesterday, and I've got one in front of me right now, actually, and
Nice.
it's continuing to taste really good, which
Well,
is
that's
great.
good. So, how did you get started in beer? I mean, maybe people don't know because there's new people finding Ontario craft beer all the time. So maybe
Mm.
people don't even know the Denison story. But how did that start?
Well, it was long before, I mean, not long before, it's before Denison's. At age 21, I was thinking of leaving England. My mother was Canadian, had been Canadian, but living in England. At least I had relatives over here. And I was a mechanical engineer, and I thought, well, why don't I go over to North America? Because England's often tough to start working in, all the hierarchy and so on. Go over to North America, and maybe I can get a not part-time, but a relatively temporary job with my family business. Well, my family business was Molson at the time.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it was always part of me growing up was that company in Canada that made beer. And very fortunately, I was offered a job by the company, age 21, and I came over to do energy management. Basically, bring some European thought to the way companies operate, manufacturing companies operate in North America, because they'd just been hit with the oil embargo, 1973, right? And everyone was desperate to save.
You're saying this like I remember, Michael.
Right?
I'm not that
I don't
old.
know. Well, there was put it this way, that's the first time they really felt vulnerable
Okay.
to the oil producers, and there was this big move to try and reduce energy consumption.
So are
So
you
that,
actually related to the Molson family?
yep, yep,
Okay.
I am.
I didn't know
Um,
that.
no, it's not something I publicize. I mean, the relationship is that my great grandfather was the guy who ran the brewery, so
Okay.
it's quite distant, but um,
That's
you
cool.
know, yep, in the
Your,
30s that
your,
was.
your beer roots go way back.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So anyway, I came over, and was surprised because I really enjoyed the beer business, and my sort of what I thought might have been a 1 year or maybe 2 year work assignment became 10 years. I
Wow.
worked for Molson for 10 years till 1986. That was 76 to 86. I was at the Toronto Brewery that no longer exists, which was on Fleet Street. That's
Hmm.
where a bunch of condos are now.
Yep.
But it was the biggest and most modern brewery in Canada at the time.
Was the transition from there to starting your own thing, or was there something in between?
No, it was a case where we parted in 1986, largely because I don't think I'm a big company person.
Hmm.
I've been called by certain people as not being a team player. And while I regard that as a bit of a compliment in some ways, it also means you probably, would not be good working in the, large company environment.
Right.
So we parted in 1986. I was offered a job in Vancouver by them that didn't appeal to me, and I think that was possibly part of the intention there.
Mm.
And we left.
What's the impetus for craft beer? I mean, obviously you got your feet wet at Molson, so you learned a lot of the logistics and big brewery side of things, and learned maybe being a company man wasn't your thing. So you can definitely
Mm.
see how you're starting to lay the foundation for doing craft beer. But I mean, in 1986, how does an Ontarian or someone living in Ontario even start to think about craft beer? I mean, what's your exposure to craft beer at the time?
Well, there was a bit of a gap there because I said, okay, so I've left Molson here. I'd really want to do brewing school.
Mm.
So I went to, as a private, student, to Siebel Institute of Technology in Chicago, the 1987 course, and it was a great experience. While I was there, it may have been earlier, I met somebody at a wedding who was a German, actually a German prince, funnily enough. His name was Prince Luitpold von Bayern. And I met him, and he had the idea, or been thinking of bringing his brewpub equipment over to North America, because that was his sideline, aside from a larger brewery. And he was going to put a brewpub in Montreal with a few Canadian business people. And I got introduced to him, and I think he realized that with 10 years of Molson background, and I was quite keen to actually get into craft beer, and certainly a smaller operation. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
he thought I'd be an asset, and so we you can't say hooked up these days, can you? No. We formed a friendship and a business relationship, and we also convinced him to move that brew pub to Toronto, and that's what became 75 Victoria Street in Toronto,
Okay,
also
okay.
known as Growlers and Denisons and so on and so forth.
Right. I mean, your story almost sounds made up. Like you're like I worked at Molson and then met a German prince who went. It's a bit of a
Yeah,
beer fairy tale.
yeah. Well, it was a great privilege to work with him because he's actually, he was a hardworking guy. He actually was a lawyer technically, but he had taken over his grandmother's business of brewing, and beer was just in his blood. And I think he sensed that I also was really into beer culture. So that was a good relationship there. And I was certainly very fortunate to be immersed in German beer culture just by basically doing business with him. I traveled over to Germany a couple of times, did all obviously the Oktoberfest, but more local beer festivals and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that was it. That was the start of Denison's.
Well, it sounds like a pretty good beer pedigree. I mean, I'm assuming you had some of the British pub culture from the days of your youth, and then you had Molson, and then you had.
Yeah, not a lot of pub culture, because actually, as I said to Crystal Luxmore on one of her first interviews years ago, because she asked me the same thing about British pub culture and so on. I said, well, actually, when I was at university, we didn't drink much beer. Um, going down to the local pub, you were regarded as those damn students, who lived down the road, and all the old fogies didn't want you coming into their living room. And so what we did is we sat around a lot of the time and listened to Pink Floyd and the Allman Brothers, and smoking various drugs and doing other drugs for that matter. And so that was my entertainment. It was not beer.
Folks, are you like me? Do you like supporting independent breweries? Yeah, you do. What better independent brewery to support right now than the Indie Ale House? Indie is right in the name, so you know they're independent. They're located in Toronto. Their brew pub is in the Junction, and they have a brewery in Italy in the Manulife Center as well. Of course, these are weird times for going out. Maybe you're not ready. Maybe you don't even live in Toronto. That's okay. You can still try the delicious beers that they're making at the Indie Ale House because they made it easy. Beer to your door, ordered from the comfort and safety of your own home. That's my favorite way to order things. You got free delivery anywhere in Toronto if you order 12 beers or more, and a flat rate anywhere else in Ontario. Why not order a Stay Home Pale Ale? $1 from every can of Stay Home purchased will be donated to the fund that supports their employees that have been temporarily laid off due to COVID-19. Check them out at indiealehouse.com. So you launched your brew pub with the
Mhm.
help of a German prince. What did the beer landscape in Ontario look like at the time? I mean, it seems like it would be daunting to understand what the market would be interested in at that time.
Yeah, well, there was, as I mentioned before, there was Brick, there was Creemore. Creemore was 87, I guess. I can't remember when Brick was. Brick was probably 84. Um, One other brew pub in Toronto who made a number of different kinds of beers, and we thought that we would have a good chance of getting a good following for making authentic German style beers. Because we could order the yeast from Germany, from Prince Leopold's breweries. At that time, there weren't the yeast banks around that you can just order yeast from. So, and that was our niche. And we started with a pale lager which, funnily enough, is pretty much the recipe for side launch mountain lager.
Really?
Now, the pale lager, yeah. Well, I mean, it's not much of a recipe because it's very, very simple, and it comes down to technique and ingredients. But we started with that and a dark lager, which we called Royal Donkel,
Yep.
which is basically what side launch dark is, or which is now called Midnight something.
Hmm.
And we started with those. And the interesting thing here, this was quite unusual, is we sold these beers in a filtered and unfiltered state. We had 4 taps. We had dark lager, filtered and unfiltered, and pale lager, filtered and unfiltered.
Hmm.
And it didn't take long before we realized that the dark lager was aged long enough that it looked filtered, even though it wasn't.
Hmm.
So we dropped the filtered dark lager. And the very first spring, that was November, and then springtime came around, and Prince Leopold said, well, you know what you got to make? You got to make wheat beer. And I'll show you how. So that was the introduction of the wheat, which was, I guess, May 1990. Yeah. Yeah.
So that beer's been around a while. I mean, all of those beers are still around. Well, I guess you can get the mountain lager if you're a licensee or direct from the brewery, but those are all pretty old recipes that are still kicking around somewhere in Ontario.
Actually, the brewery, I think, has realized that restricting its availability maybe wasn't the best idea, and has now, I think, started selling it province-wide by delivery for those that want to
Nice.
pay for it that way. But it was called originally Growler's Lager, and then it was later called Bavarian Hell, because I was importing the malt from Bavaria, and or at least I wasn't at the time. Excuse me. I had in mind to import it from Bavaria, and I did a couple of test brews with Bavarian malt, and it just transformed that beer. And so basically from, I think, about 1995 onwards, we made it with all Bavarian malt.
So was the reaction positive from the beginning? That sounds like I can't even think of a brew pub that if a brew pub did that now, it would feel gimmicky. Like, oh, we do all German styles. We have like that sounds amazing right now. But what
Yeah,
does 1980, what is 1990 Toronto? How's the reaction to that concept?
I think the reaction was good. Unfortunately, the business model there was sort of fated from the start.
Hmm.
We had a ton of space. We had 2 floors. I don't know how many seats we had. We had a bar downstairs and basically 2 restaurants upstairs. We were paying over $40,000 a month in rent, and we needed about $3 million in sales a year just to break even,
Wow.
and that's pretty decent amount. Shortly after we opened, Ron Keefe opened with the Granite,
Yep.
Mount Pleasant and Eglinton, and he had less ambitious plans, smaller venue and so on and so forth. And he's obviously survived, hasn't he? He's
Well,
30 years. Yeah,
nothing survives that Victoria Street location. I mean, Duggan's was probably
Duggan's
doomed to
lasted
this,
a
probably the
year.
same
Yeah.
landlord, right? So I imagine the expense has always been the same. I mean, even Molson couldn't make a go of it and had to change concepts. So
Mhm.
it's an interesting space with a steeped history in Ontario beer, but obviously very difficult to make it financially worthwhile,
Yeah, that's true. And I'm sure Molson is having a tough time with it as well.
especially right now. Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
exactly. And it was quite difficult because a lot of our customers were coming from west of Yonge Street, basically.
Hmm.
So it was always a bit of a walk to get to, Victoria. Victoria, the east of Yonge was seen to be a sort of quiet area that had potential,
Yeah,
but actually
that's
that
funny.
potential didn't really occur in our ownership anyway,
Yeah.
because the theater district opened on the west, on the west side of. This was even before the major theaters on the west side of town.
So from 1990, the wheat beer launched. How long was it before? I mean, maybe I'm just like being a fanboy, because I know that beer is like it's the gold standard for wheat beer in Ontario. Was there a point at which you were just like, okay, I've got gold here?
Well, we had a very, very strong following, but it never meant, huge income, let's face it, because
Right,
um, we were a brew pub. And by the way, it should be remembered that we were not allowed to sell off premise.
right.
There was no takeout beer. Everything had to be consumed in that space. But I will say that what probably really made the wheat beer was Josh Oakes. Do you know Josh? Who I mean by
No,
Josh? Okay. Josh Oakes was a early rate beer. He wasn't just a rater or a writer. I think he was a moderator or somehow involved with rate beer on the Canadian end of things. Great beer enthusiast, and he wrote a glowing review of our wheat beer. First of all, I think I can't remember what the publication was, but eventually on Rate Beer, and that just started it took off from that point on.
imagine a world when not everyone with a phone in their hand could review a beer and a review
Yeah,
actually meant something.
I didn't even know what a cell phone was. I mean, there were people wandering around with suitcases, and I think they might have been a cell phone.
The original. Are you a bar owner or a restaurant owner wishing it was easier to order beer? Well, guess what? Now you can with Order Simply. Order Simply is a web based platform which makes it easier for bars, restaurants, and other licensees to purchase the great Ontario craft beers that I sometimes talk about on this very show. From finding new products, making the checkout and payment seamless, and tracking and invoicing orders, Order Simply makes the process simple. That makes sense. It's called Order Simply. I get it now. The name, I just got it. I just got it. On top of making ordering more simple for buyers and sellers, Order Simply has partnerships with local charities providing a portion of all their profits to fight food insecurity in their customers' communities, which you gotta love, unless you're a piece of garbage. Order Simply is launching their platform this summer. Check them out at ordersimply.ca, find them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So, at a certain point, obviously, you realized it wasn't financially viable to stay in the space. Was there a gap when you stopped brewing your beer? Or has the Weiss beer been brewed consistently since 1990?
No, what happened was, I mean, I know you were interviewing Greg Taylor the other day,
Hmm.
um, and he was quite honest about things, and I will be too, is that we were thrown out of the place by the landlord
Okay,
after 20, 15 years or whatever it was, because we could not afford to pay the rent.
right. That's a
And
fair reason to be thrown out, though. Let's.
it is. So we did a midnight move, and I saw this coming, and I said, "What am I going to do?" And I agreed to that the wheat beer would be the one beer that would be really good to keep alive.
Hmm.
So that's what I did. This was 2003,
Hmm.
and I kept the wheat beer alive, and then later on the dark lager by brewing at Mill Street.
Right.
I mean, Mill Street hadn't opened at that stage, 2003. So I
Yeah.
helped them set up, Mike Duggan and everything, set up the place in the distillery district.
Yep.
And the deal was that I would get a tank of theirs to call my own and brew wheat beer in there. So I did that every week or two and shipped out kegs and had no packaging. So I know Steve Abrams very well, and a guy called Jeff Cooper, who was originally one of their partners too,
Yep.
and Mike Duggan.
Yep.
And then I needed more capacity, so I got in touch with a friend who'd actually been one of our employees at the brew pub. Ken Woods
Okay.
is of Black Oak Brewing,
Yep.
and we started making wheat beer at his place as well. And then later on, I can't remember when I brought in the dark lager, but that was probably when I moved to Cool.
Hmm.
Some people have said I'm the horror of the industry, and I have been around.
Yeah, I was gonna say that you
Literally.
once ran down all the systems you've brewed your wheat beer on, and it was pretty amazing, considering that it's been pretty consistent.
Yeah, we definitely had some periods when it was not great, but yeah, it must have been, it was quite a challenge, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it was on my radar until probably 2010, 2011. So that would have been well
Yeah.
into cool by then, right?
By that time, I was at Cool, and funnily enough, I was actually also brewing in Amsterdam,
Okay. Where did you
because
not brew, Michael?
because Cool had a can filler that they hadn't got ready when I would really have liked to use it. It had some startup issues, and yet Amsterdam did have a functioning can filler.
Huh.
So I made a deal with them. If I brewed with them, I could use their can filler. So
So you
the
went from cool
well,
to, I mean, the
to
narrative as I see it was that somebody wanted to start a brewery and decided to tap you
yeah,
and your recipes. Is that a fair assessment of how Side Launch started?
yeah. It was 2010.
Yeah.
Um, I met this group of people. I was thrilled because they certainly showed the ability to raise a decent amount of capital.
Yeah.
It was really great. They wanted to open in the Creemore Collingwood area. I did spend a little time trying to convince them to open in Toronto, and but they quickly realized that with the property taxes and so on and so forth, it wasn't a good idea. So we turned our attention back to Collingwood, and in the meantime visited equipment manufacturers, a company called Siemens in Germany. I went over with Garnet Siddle, who was the only other employee at the time, and we had discussions with them, and I did a brew of a pale ale in Germany
Mm.
for Siemens. Came back here because it was in the fermenter, and then they went bankrupt.
Oh.
And this is one of the largest brewing equipment manufacturers in the world. I mean, way bigger than NSI or whatever,
Yep.
came quite a lot later. And so I never got to taste that beer.
Oh, it was probably the best one you ever brewed,
I,
right?
I don't know. I have no idea.
It's the one that got away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody drank that beer. You must be, someone
Well,
drank that
actually,
beer.
the brewer did say it was pretty good, but I have no idea as to whether he's being a nice guy or not.
So you
Anyway,
went from, okay, so I'm just trying to do the chronology. You already had basically all the beers that Side launched with were your original recipes, right? I mean, the wheat beer, the Dunkel, and the pale ale. Was that one of your
pale
older?
ale was a beer I hadn't made before. I mean, I was very, very narrow-minded and narrow in my, German-style beers at the
Hmm.
brewpub. But Garnet asked me to make a pale ale, and I said, okay. I did some research. I thought American-style pale ale, and I did pilot brews in the garage of a place in Cabbagetown during probably 2013, and that was the pale ale that
Okay.
eventually opened.
Now, when did the Mountain Lager come to be? Because that is was one of my favorite lagers ever. So good.
Well, we built the brewery, side launch in 2013, opened spring of 2014, and the the beer took off. We had quite a hardworking sales team, and we were just swamped. We could not produce enough beer
Yeah.
for the first year, and then we put in more tanks, and then we couldn't make enough beer for the second year, and we were growing at 60% a year. So there was, even though back in the back of my mind, I'd love to have introduced the mountain lager or a pale lager, it simply wasn't possible. And I think it was after a year or two after we opened that we finally saw an opportunity to make it. So
So you were
we
sitting
did
on it for a while waiting.
we did test brews, yeah,
Also,
and
you mentioned Side Launch's like astronomical growth, which I thought was just the perception, because all of a sudden it seemed like Side Launch came out of nowhere and was everywhere. But no, it's you were selling and selling and selling. So it was a quickly successful company, at least it appeared that way.
yeah, no, it was, and there's no question it was very successful uh, in terms of sales and volume growth.
Right.
There were some real challenges in view of the amount of money that had been spent, and from a capital point of view, but also ongoing expenses because of the structure of the business.
Hmm.
made it very difficult to turn a profit. And there were, a couple more calls for cash in those first two or 3 years from the investors, which
Interesting.
included me.
Now, I recognize we may be getting to sticky territory here, but I feel like I heard less and less about Michael Hancock being part of that operation, and I was curious, always curious as to what was going on there, which culminated in one of what I, just described as one of my favorite loggers suddenly disappearing. I don't know if I've messed up those timelines or if you want to get into it, but I've always thought you were the best asset of that company, and now you're not part of it. So we'll
Hmm.
tread carefully, but
Oh, okay, I'll obviously be careful, but I'll be truthful at the same time. Um, when a group of business people hire um, people for their expertise, and this certainly was the case with me and with this guy Curtis Singh, who had built Creemore, and he, as I say, he helped with building. Um, there comes a time very often when they don't necessarily want to hear what you've been hired for, and I think this has happened um, quite a few times. This is not unique. I can think right away: Brick Brewing, Jim Brickman, Gary McMullen, Muskoka, um, Greg Taylor, you know, uh,
yeah,
Steam Whistle, much more recently. And this, I think, was basically what was happening in our case. I actually was the last of the original management team to still be around in 2018. Everyone else had gone, basically, in management.
yeah, wow,
And so it was quite a turbulent environment. Um, I will say it was fueled by that good old thing, wanting to make money. And when you're in business with people who are in the financial business and money appears not to be made, they will look for any way possible, to find out how to rectify that, which includes saying goodbye to people. And Garnett was one of the first casualties there,
right.
who was the CEO.
Yeah, it's always interesting when you see that the talent that has built the company suddenly has too much to say about making the product or making the company versus making the money, and unfortunately get squeezed out. You can almost pinpoint it if you're paying attention from a consumer point of view. I mean, I feel like I could. Same thing with Steam Whistle. I started to see some weird things happening there that weren't consistent with what I thought of the brand. And same with Side Launch. As you're saying this, I'm remembering a time now when Side Launch wheat cans were essentially becoming sour on their
Yeah.
own.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you guys made the decision to pull those from shelves. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember applauding that at the time because a lot of breweries probably would have tried to be quiet about it. And I can
Yeah.
only imagine what that conversation was like and who was probably leading the decision to recall that beer within the company at the time. Or maybe I'm just, imagining things, but I can imagine where you were on that argument.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've always been tried to be honest in life and open, and some people have referred to me as a loose cannon. That's another expression, but um, I think that honesty is very important. And we felt that if we were honest and took the product back and dealt with everyone the way they should be, that we'd come out on top. Um, we apparently did there. It cost the company a lot of money, but I think, our sales did not suffer. It apparently. Um, it did happen a second time a few months later.
So, important question. Those recipes that you've had forever, do you still own them? Is like, how does that, could you make those beers again somewhere else, please?
No,
No? Really?
no.
Oh my
I
God.
I I certainly felt I was had teamed up with a really great crowd that well crowd's the wrong word team, and I basically sold my company Denison's to them, which included the recipes.
Wow.
I quite frankly never expected to be leaving. Um, certainly not the way it happened. I expected to be crawling in through the door age 75, or using my walker to get around the brewery.
Right.
But that obviously has not happened. But so can I make those beers? No, there's non-compete clauses that basically say I cannot. Truth of the matter is, most people know that non-compete clauses are there to be challenged, and they're very hard to enforce. That has not been one of my desires to get into that kind of. I don't really want to make those beers again.
But what if I want you to?
Well, no, I mean, I put everything I had into that brewery. I'm 65 years old. I'm not going to go out and, in this climate, start a brewery, or certainly not start making these beers in front of, waving a flag in front of the bull. It's just not worth it. So
Right. I don't get as much as you said you're a shit disturber. I think you know where to draw the line. I think you're being pretty polite about things, frankly. So this is an insane time, as you mentioned, but I think Ontario would love to know if you're going to make beer somewhere else ever again, because you make fantastic beer and we want to drink it.
I think a lot has happened in the last few years. I mean, I was sort of early in on the craft brewing scene.
Yeah.
I was always about simplicity and authenticity, and
We don't give a
really.
shit about that stuff anymore.
Okay, well, that
Put it
was
in a barrel
important
and
to
put
me.
fruit in it, Michael.
I think that was one of the reasons that I was successful, and I think now there are other people making really good examples of the beers that I started with.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the Mountain Lager, yes, it's still fantastic. I agree, but there's also some great examples out there. Gaslight Helles from Muddy York.
Yeah.
Wellington County came up with their Helles or
Yep.
whatever. There's a ton of them around, and I think that actually shines a light on what a strange decision it was to withdraw Mountain from the market right when everyone else was starting to make really good Helles, and that category itself was starting to take off.
Yeah. I mean,
I
and it
think,
was like every beer nerd in Ontario, it was their favorite beer. And then all of a sudden it was gone. I mean, it seems spiteful. I'll just put that out there and we can let it die there, but definitely an unfortunate decision. I'm glad to see that because of consumer demand, it's crept back in. So I know that it's available. I can get it on tap in one spot in London, I think, because there's a place called Company Bar that some guys I went to high school with, the Wolf brothers, own it, and they've hired this guy Nick Farmer, who is a
mhm.
fantastic beer guy who came from Milos, and he curates their beer tap, and he said we gotta have Mountain Lager on tap, so you can get it there at least. So there's one place in town I can still find it on tap. I think Beer Town too, actually. There's a Beer
Okay,
Town.
yeah, no, funnily enough, Beertown were one of the, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're a
It's a franchise.
multi-location
Yeah, yeah,
franchise.
yeah.
And I do know that they were very vocal when it was not made available, and to licensees originally. And they said, if you don't make this beer available to licensees that want it, we're going to drop you as a brewery. So yeah,
Well,
but
bless those
you can
vocal,
thank them.
yeah,
Yeah,
bless the vocal bar owners and bartenders who are speaking up for consumers.
and
Um,
plenty of others. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, no, that was a strange decision. So you didn't really answer my question though.
So
Are you brewing beer now? Do you even home brew? Like, do you get the
no,
bug?
funny enough, I've never home brewed. I mean, I brewed cider actually with apple juice and wheat beer yeast, but
Oh
that was a
yeah.
long time ago for fun. But no, I home brewed in early days at Molson, so that might have been 1980, and I made ginger beer with Molson Canadian yeast, and it was a
Wow.
disaster. It was a disaster.
Sounds like a disaster.
It was sulfurous and so on. No, I honestly feel I mean, if somebody approached me and asked me, I might consider making beer, but my skill set is pretty well defined, you know.
Right.
And I devoted the hours I worked were just crazy right from the start when we opened the brew pub. And I'm 65. I know most people don't see 65 as a cutoff date, but I I see it as a reason not to go out beating the bush, beating the pavement
Yeah.
to make more,
Sure.
particularly in this environment. So what I know good at is troubleshooting, mechanical troubleshooting.
Hmm.
So I've done some consulting work with a great brewery run by some good friends, Microbrasserie Charlevoix
Okay.
in Bay St. Paul in Quebec. Wonderful place that started in 1996 doing Belgian beers, all Belgian beers. And so I did some consulting with them last December. And that's the kind of thing I'd like to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're not making beer, you're still
Mm-hmm.
drinking beer. What do you drink these days besides, beers that you developed the recipe for? Who are you liking?
Um, well, I will say that I still have an incredible soft spot for the wheat beer.
Hmm.
Just love it. But beyond that, um, this will not go down well with craft brewers.
Oh, good.
Not for the reason that you're thinking, but having gone to the Czech Republic
Yeah.
in November of whenever it was, a couple of years ago, and getting immersed in Czech beers, I developed a love for Czech Var
Oh, yeah.
because it's a bit softer than Pilsner Urquell.
Hmm.
Anyway, I've got cans of that in my fridge, and the main thing here is that it is so reasonably priced. I do not understand how they must be dumping. Well, they're not dumping because it's very cheap over in Czech Republic as well.
Hmm.
But to get a 500 ml can of imported beer in fairly good condition, which is used not to be the case, for $2.50 or something, makes it hard but not impossible for me to buy. Let's just say a wonderful example: Luc Lafontaine's beer at Godspeed, his Czech lager, which was inspired by the same trip that we took together.
Yes, I know
Uh,
about
he,
this trip. It
he,
sounded
yeah,
like a hell of a trip.
it was a great trip, and Matt from Tooth and Nail was on that trip too, and Milos was too.
Of course he was.
Of course he was. He's on all of them. But basically, Luke is a go-getter, and he came back and said, "I'm going to make a good Czech lager," and he did. I was without a brewery at that time, so it made it a little difficult to produce the Czech lager, and I couldn't really. In the end, I did do what I would call an emotional, nostalgic hookup with link with Chloe Lovett with the brew pub, and that's why we produced the Czech lager at the brew pub for the 30th anniversary on Victoria Street.
Oh, nice.
I didn't want to do German for reasons that probably obvious. I figured I could get away with Czech.
So what became of that beer? I don't
That
even.
beer sold out quickly. It
Oh,
was available. I mean, we made 10 hectoliters of it.
yeah.
It sold at the brew pub on tap for, I don't know, a few weeks. But they also bottled quite a bit of it and sent it up to Creemore retail store
Okay.
because it's batch and as part of the Creemore organization. So
Right.
you could buy that, until a couple of months later at
Nice.
the Creemore Brewery. Yeah.
Nice. Well, it's been lovely talking to you, sir. I'm
Mm.
I'm glad we finally managed to make this happen.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure. I'm sorry it took so long.
It's okay. It's a weird time. I get
Yeah,
it.
it is. Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to say I'm a free man now.
Good.
So
I'm glad. Well, as long as you're happy and you're still enjoying your own wheat beer and you're a free man, I think that's all you can ask for.
yeah.
If you find yourself in London, I know where Czech Bar is always on tap. Thanks for listening. Be sure and wash your hands.